I never thought a simple flight home would become a nightmare. It was a rainy Friday evening, the kind of night that blankets the sky in a thick, gray shroud. I arrived at the airport just in time, the sound of rain tapping against the terminal windows only heightening my sense of urgency. As I made my way through security, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if the air itself was charged with a strange energy. The flight was overbooked, and I found myself squeezed into a middle seat next to a woman with headphones in and a man who looked as if he hadn't slept in days. I tried to make small talk, but they were both preoccupied, so I settled back in my seat, hoping to close my eyes for the duration of the flight. When the flight attendant appeared for the first time, it was immediately unsettling. She was tall and slim, with stark, platinum blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her uniform, pristine and sharp, contrasted sharply with the mood of the cabin. Her name tag read Charlotte, and she had a smile that felt forced, like she was practicing for a part in a play. "Good evening, everyone," she announced in a voice that was almost too sweet. "Welcome aboard Flight 312. We're expecting some turbulence, but rest assured, we will be taking off shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." I glanced at my seatmate, who looked equally uneasy, and then back at Charlotte. She was staring intently at me as she spoke, her eyes piercing through the dim cabin light. I could feel a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off, attributing it to my overactive imagination. As the plane taxied down the runway, Charlotte began her safety demonstration. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical. "In case of an emergency," she said, "your seat can be used as a flotation device." She demonstrated, but there was something eerie about the way she handled the life vest, like she was more interested in the vest itself than the safety of the passengers. Once we were in the air, the cabin began to settle, but I couldn't shake my discomfort. I took out my phone to distract myself, scrolling through social media to ease my mind. That's when I noticed something odd. There were no announcements from the cockpit about our altitude or cruising speed, which was unusual. Typically, the pilots would keep us updated during the flight. After a while, Charlotte returned with the beverage cart, her smile still in place. "Can I get you anything to drink?" she asked, her voice sugary sweet yet laced with an unsettling edge. "I'll have a water, please," I replied, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. She poured the water and handed it to me with a slightly shaky hand. "Be careful, dear. It's quite cold," she warned, her smile faltering for just a moment. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination, but there seemed to be a hint of something sinister behind her words. I took a sip, and the water tasted strange, almost metallic. I frowned, pushing the cup away as Charlotte moved to the next passenger. I watched her as she continued down the aisle, engaging with passengers in a way that felt too intimate for a stranger. It was as if she was seeking something from them, something that made me deeply uncomfortable. Suddenly, the cabin lights flickered. The plane jolted, and I felt a rush of panic. I turned to my seatmate, who was now wide-eyed and looking around nervously. "Did you feel that?" I whispered. "Yeah," he replied, voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" Just then, the plane's intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some unexpected turbulence, but please remain calm. We will get through this." I tried to focus on the captain's voice, but my eyes were drawn back to Charlotte. She was standing in the aisle, staring at the emergency exit, her expression oddly tranquil amidst the chaos. I leaned over to my seatmate. "What is she doing?" "I don't know, man. This is getting weird," he replied, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The turbulence intensified, and the cabin filled with a low, ominous rumble. People began to murmur nervously, and I could feel my heart racing. I glanced at Charlotte again, and this time, her gaze met mine. Her eyes were uncomfortably wide, a glint of something dark flickering within them. "Everything is fine," she said, her voice eerily calm as the plane bucked again. Just a little bump in the road. But I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the edge of the cart tightly. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to breathe through my mounting anxiety. When I opened them again, I noticed that some of the other passengers were now staring at Charlotte, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. She was moving closer to the emergency exit, her lips moving as if she was whispering something to herself. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaky. "What are you doing?" Charlotte turned slowly, her smile returning, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just making sure everything is safe for you, dear," she said, her tone overly sweet, but there was an edge to her words that sent a shiver down my spine. As the turbulence subsided, I felt a momentary sense of relief. But it was short-lived. A deep rumble echoed through the cabin, and the lights flickered again. Charlotte's demeanor shifted, she became even more frenetic, darting down the aisle, her smile morphing into something more menacing. "Stay in your seats," she shouted suddenly, her voice sharp. The calm atmosphere that had settled around us was shattered, replaced by chaos. People began to panic, some shouting, others crying. "What's happening?" I yelled, my heart racing as I clutched my armrests. My seatmate was looking around frantically, and I could see fear etched across the faces of those nearby. "Charlotte!" I screamed, desperate for some reassurance. "What's going on?" She stopped in front of me, her smile back in place but now looking more like a grimace. "Just a little turbulence, dear. Nothing to worry about. But you need to stay calm. It's important." Before I could respond, the plane shook violently again, sending drinks flying and causing passengers to scream. I watched as Charlotte moved toward the back of the plane, her body tense, her posture rigid. I had the unsettling feeling that she was preparing for something far worse than turbulence. "I'm getting out of here," my seatmate said suddenly, trying to unbuckle his seatbelt. "I can't take this." "Wait!" I shouted, grabbing his arm. "Don't." But it was too late. He yanked his arm free and bolted down the aisle, shouting for help. The other passengers turned to look, their expressions a mix of fear and disbelief. I felt a rising panic, knowing he was making a terrible mistake. Charlotte whipped around, her eyes narrowing as she took a step toward him. "Sir, return to your seat immediately," she ordered, her voice now authoritative and chilling. "I need to get off this plane," he yelled, his voice breaking as he reached the rear exit. But before he could reach it, Charlotte moved with a speed I didn't think possible, blocking his path. "Stay where you are," she commanded, her voice low and dangerous. The plane shook again, but this time it felt different, more violent. I could hear the engine sputtering, the sound reverberating through the cabin like an ominous warning. I turned back to my seatmate, who was now staring at Charlotte, a mix of terror and confusion in his eyes. "What is happening?" he whispered, backing away slowly. Charlotte's smile returned, but it was devoid of warmth. "Just a little turbulence, dear," she said again, her voice dripping with malice. "But I can promise you this, it will get worse before it gets better." Panic surged through me, and I felt the weight of dread pressing down. I looked around, noticing other passengers were beginning to cry, some praying, others simply staring blankly into space, lost in fear. The cabin felt thick with anxiety, the air heavy as if something terrible was about to happen. "Everyone, listen to me," I shouted, my voice shaking but desperate. "We need to stay calm. We can't let this get out of control." But my words fell on deaf ears. The chaos escalated as passengers began to scream, some attempting to open the overhead compartments in a frenzied bid to escape. I could feel the plane shudder again, the vibrations intensifying, and the cabin lights flickered ominously. Charlotte suddenly laughed, a low, unsettling sound that echoed in the chaos. "You're all so afraid. Why don't you embrace it?" she said, her eyes glinting with something dark and primal. Fear is a wonderful thing, don't you think? Shut up, someone yelled from the back, and I felt a surge of anger and defiance. Just do your job. I shouted at her. Get us out of here. Her smile faltered for a moment, revealing a glimpse of the turmoil beneath. You don't understand, she said, her voice softening, but there was no comfort in it. This is only the beginning. Before I could respond, the cabin lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The only sound was the deep thrum of the engines struggling against the storm outside. I could hear the panic rising again, the screams echoing in the pitch blackness. I fumbled for my phone, trying to use its light to illuminate the space around me. When I turned it on, the glow revealed terrified faces all around. Charlotte was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Stay together. I urged the passengers around me, trying to instill some sense of unity. We have to stick together. Just then, a loud bang reverberated through the cabin, and the plane lurched violently to one side. People screamed as the overhead compartments flew open, bags spilling out. I gripped my seat tightly, trying to remain calm amid the chaos. Charlotte. We need you, someone yelled into the darkness, but there was no response. Then, in the dim light of my phone, I saw her figure appear at the front of the cabin. She looked different, her hair disheveled and her uniform slightly askew. What's all this noise about? She asked, her tone unnervingly cheerful despite the chaos around her. People are scared. I shouted. We need to land. Don't be silly, she replied, her smile stretching wider. This is just a little fun. Let the fear flow. I couldn't comprehend her words, the madness of it all. I felt a surge of anger and desperation. You're supposed to keep us safe. I yelled, standing up despite the turbulence. You're not a part of this. She turned her gaze on me, and for a moment, I saw the facade slip. Her eyes were cold and empty, void of empathy. I am part of this, dear, she said softly. And soon, you will understand. Before I could respond, the plane jolted again, and I was thrown against the wall of the cabin. Panic surged as I struggled to regain my footing, my heart racing. The lights flickered back on, revealing chaos. People were screaming, some crying, while others were frantically searching for something, anything, to hold on to. Charlotte, please. We need to land. I pleaded, desperation creeping into my voice. She stepped closer, her expression suddenly shifting to one of eerie calmness. You really think you can escape, don't you? She said, her voice chillingly soft. This is just the beginning of your journey. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I had to confront her. You're not in control here. I shouted, anger bubbling up. We won't let fear consume us. Her smile widened, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something glint in her eyes, a flicker of respect, perhaps. Ah, the brave one, she said, almost mockingly. But bravery won't save you. With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkened cabin. I felt a chill wash over me as I turned to my fellow passengers, their faces mirroring my own fear and confusion. Stay together. We can't let her win. I urged, trying to rally everyone. But the chaos around us was overwhelming. The cabin shook violently again, and the lights flickered out one more time. Just then, the intercom crackled back to life, the captain's voice echoing through the dark. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are making an emergency landing. Brace yourselves. A flicker of hope surged through me. Maybe we would escape this nightmare after all. But as the plane began its descent, I noticed something disturbing. Charlotte was standing at the rear of the cabin, her gaze fixed on me, that same unsettling smile plastered on her face. As we landed, the plane shuddered and jolted, the impact sending us all forward. I braced myself against the seat in front of me, and when the plane finally came to a stop, I was filled with a mix of relief and terror. The doors opened, and emergency lights flooded the cabin. Passengers scrambled to get off, but as I moved toward the exit, I glanced back at Charlotte. She was standing at the door, her smile unwavering. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her voice eerily sweet. "I hope you enjoyed your journey. Remember, fear is just the beginning." With that, she stepped back into the shadows of the plane, leaving me to grapple with the aftermath of the chaos. I stumbled off the plane into the safety of the tarmac, but the memory of her eyes, the chilling smile, and the darkness that enveloped us remained with me. I realized then that this flight wasn't just a terrifying experience, it was a reminder of how fear can linger long after the journey ends. As I looked back at the plane, a shiver ran down my spine, knowing I had escaped the nightmare, but the shadows still haunted me. I walked away from the aircraft, surrounded by the safety of the ground crew and the chaos of emergency responders. But the thought of Charlotte and the darkness of that flight would forever stay etched in my mind. I knew, deep down, that I would never look at a flight the same way again. The fear had rooted itself in me, and I wondered when I might encounter that unsettling presence again, perhaps on another flight, or maybe even in my dreams. As I stepped onto the tarmac, the fresh air filled my lungs, but it did little to alleviate the suffocating dread that clung to me. Emergency personnel rushed past, their voices raised in urgency, but I felt detached from the chaos around me. I could still see the plane, its fuselage glinting under the airport lights, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of it. "Are you okay?" a paramedic asked, placing a hand on my shoulder. I flinched at the sudden contact, startled back to reality. "Yeah," I managed to stammer, my heart racing. "I think so." He frowned, clearly seeing the fear etched across my face. "You need to sit down. We have to check you out." As they led me to a nearby ambulance, I kept glancing over my shoulder at the aircraft. It stood ominously against the night sky, an inky silhouette that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. I couldn't help but wonder if Charlotte was still inside, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her next opportunity. Once inside the ambulance, they checked my vitals, but all I could think about was the chilling smile of the flight attendant. "Did you see her?" I asked, urgency creeping into my voice. "The flight attendant, Charlotte?" The paramedic raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "No one named Charlotte was on the manifest." "Are you sure she was a flight attendant?" I swallowed hard, a wave of confusion crashing over me. "She was there. She was different. Listen, it's normal to feel disoriented after a traumatic event," the paramedic said gently, but his eyes betrayed skepticism. "You might be experiencing some residual shock." "Residual shock," I echoed, the term falling flat. I shook my head, pushing away the thought that maybe I was losing my mind. But she was real. Something was wrong with her. "Let's get you checked out, okay?" he suggested, but the kindness in his voice felt patronizing. I glanced out of the ambulance at the crowd that had gathered, waiting to hear news of the passengers. It was a stark contrast to the darkness I had just experienced. After a few minutes, I was deemed physically fine but mentally shaken. They advised me to go home, rest, and perhaps seek counseling. I nodded absently, still consumed by thoughts of the flight. Once I was outside, I took a moment to breathe. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and glistening under the streetlights. My mind raced with the events of the night, but I felt an overwhelming urge to get away from the airport. As I walked to my car, I glanced back one last time at the plane. It loomed there, silent and ominous. The drive home felt surreal, as if I were moving through a dream. My thoughts kept returning to Charlotte and the unsettling things she had said. I couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't just been an employee, she felt like a harbinger of something sinister. Arriving home, I turned on every light and made myself a cup of tea to calm my nerves. I tried to focus on the comforting ritual of making tea, but the memory of her eyes haunted me. I found myself replaying every moment of the flight, searching for clues to understand what had happened. As night fell, I settled on the couch, surrounded by the warm glow of the lights. The tea had helped somewhat, but as I sat there, I heard a sound that sent chills down my spine, the unmistakable sound of a plane flying overhead. I glanced out the window just in time to see a jet cutting through the night sky, a low rumble echoing in the distance. My heart raced, and I felt a familiar sense of dread wash over me. I grabbed my phone and began scrolling through the news, hoping to find an explanation or a report on the flight I had just endured. But there was nothing, no mention of turbulence, no mention of an emergency landing. The absence of news only intensified my fear. Had the flight never really happened? Was I the only one who had experienced Charlotte and the chaos? The thought was maddening. I tossed my phone aside, frustration boiling over as I tried to comprehend the surreal nature of the evening. Suddenly, my phone buzzed, breaking the silence. I picked it up and saw a message from an unknown number. My stomach dropped. I opened it cautiously. "You'll never escape the fear. Remember your journey." Panic surged through me as I stared at the screen, heart racing. Who was this? Was it a prank? I quickly looked through my contact list, but no one I knew had that number. The message felt like a taunt, and it twisted the knife of anxiety deeper into my gut. I quickly locked my phone and turned to the window again, heart pounding in my chest. I was hyper-aware of the shadows outside, the flickering lights of passing cars casting eerie shapes against my walls. I wanted to feel safe in my own home, but that comfort was shattered by the reality of the night. Sleep eluded me. Hours passed as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the message replaying in my mind. "You'll never escape the fear." What did that even mean? Had I invited something into my life during that flight? Finally, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Nightmares haunted me, visions of the plane, Charlotte's smile, and the darkness of the cabin swirling together into a suffocating miasma. In the morning, I woke in a cold sweat, the sunlight spilling into my room and pushing away the remnants of the night. I forced myself to get out of bed and face the day, but the unease lingered. As I prepared for work, I resolved to find out what had happened on that flight. I spent the next few days digging through news articles, searching for any mention of Flight 312. To my growing horror, there was nothing, no reports, no online discussions. It was as if the flight had vanished from existence, leaving only my memories to haunt me. Determined to uncover the truth, I returned to the airport, hoping to speak with someone who might provide answers. The terminal buzzed with the usual activity, but I felt like a ghost, moving through a world that didn't recognize the horror I had experienced. After speaking with various staff, I found myself in a small office where an operations manager sat. I explained my experience, detailing everything from the strange turbulence to Charlotte's eerie demeanor. The manager listened intently but shook his head when I finished. "I'm sorry, but I can't find any record of a flight with those details. Flight 312 is scheduled to depart tomorrow, and it's operating as usual." I felt the ground shift beneath me. "No, you don't understand. I was on that flight. There was something wrong with the attendant, she wasn't normal." His expression softened, but there was still a flicker of skepticism in his eyes. It's not uncommon for people to feel disoriented after a stressful experience. I would recommend talking to someone about it. Frustrated, I stormed out of the office, feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. Had I imagined it all? The thought gnawed at me. As I left the airport, I made a vow to never fly again. But as the days turned into weeks, I found myself drawn back to that place. I needed to know if Charlotte was real. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting for me. My resolve crumbled, and I booked a ticket on the next available flight, determined to confront whatever dark presence lingered. On the day of my flight, the familiar anxiety crept back in as I approached the terminal. The smell of jet fuel and the sounds of boarding calls swirled around me, creating a cocktail of panic and determination. I steeled myself, knowing I had to face this fear head-on. As I boarded the plane, a sense of dread settled in my stomach. I took my seat and looked around, searching for any sign of Charlotte. The cabin was filled with passengers chatting, laughter echoing through the aisles, but I felt isolated in my fear. The flight began normally, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. But as we reached cruising altitude, I noticed a figure moving down the aisle. It was her, Charlotte, dressed in her crisp uniform, that unsettling smile plastered across her face. My heart raced as she approached, and a wave of panic washed over me. I forced myself to breathe, fighting against the instinct to flee. "Welcome back," she said sweetly, her eyes glimmering with something dark. "I've missed you. Why are you here?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. She leaned closer, her smile widening, as if savoring my fear. "I told you before, fear is just the beginning. This time, you will embrace it." The cabin lights flickered again, and the engine sputtered ominously. I could feel the tension in the air, an electric current that charged the atmosphere. Panic surged through the passengers, and I knew I had to confront her. "No!" I shouted, standing up, my voice steady despite the chaos around me. "You won't control me." She paused, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, but the smile returned, more sinister than before. "Ah, brave once more. But it won't be enough." Suddenly, the plane jolted violently, and passengers screamed. I could see fear reflected in their eyes, but I felt a surge of determination. "We're not afraid," I yelled to the others, my voice ringing out over the chaos. "We will not let her win." But Charlotte only laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the cabin. "You think you can fight it? You're already mine." As the plane lurched again, I felt the pull of despair. But in that moment, something deep inside me ignited. "Together!" I shouted to the passengers. "We can do this together." And as if responding to my call, they rallied. Voices rose in solidarity, drowning out Charlotte's laughter. We were no longer alone, we were united against the darkness. The cabin glowed with a fierce light, a warmth that pushed back against the shadows. "Stop this!" I yelled at Charlotte, channeling the fear into strength. "You have no power over us." Her smile faltered, the darkness flickering around her. "This isn't over," she hissed, retreating into the shadows. The turbulence subsided, and the plane steadied. We were alive, the cabin buzzing with energy. The other passengers looked at me, a mixture of gratitude and awe in their eyes. As we landed safely, I realized that I had faced my fear and survived. Charlotte's darkness had lost its grip, and I had reclaimed my power. Stepping off the plane for the last time, I felt lighter, as if the weight of that night had finally lifted. But as I walked away from the aircraft, I glanced back one last time. Charlotte stood at the door, her smile lingering, a reminder of the darkness that had sought to consume me. "Remember, fear is just the beginning," she called, her voice carrying on the wind. I turned away, but her words echoed in my mind. I knew that while I had escaped this time, the battle with fear would continue. And in that struggle, I would find strength, resilience, and a reminder that I could face the darkness, no matter how terrifying it might be.